In this video lesson, we'll discuss the newly freedmen, the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, and Andrew Johnson as president. Following the Civil War, the problems of peace are going to become the new topic. What should be done with all the captured Confederate ringleaders that are liable for treason? Jefferson Davis was temporarily clapped into irons during the early years of his 2-year imprisonment, but he and his conspirators were finally released, partly because the odds were that no Virginia jury would convict them of the charge of treason. All rebel leaders were finally pardoned by President Johnson as a sort of Christmas present in 1868, but Congress did not remove all remaining civil disabilities until 30 years later, and only restored Davis's citizenship more than a century later. In the South, not only had an age perished, but a civilization had collapsed. Both its economic and social structure was gone forever. Charleston and Richmond were rubble-strewn and weed-choked. Economic life had creaked to a halt. Banks and business houses had locked their doors. Ruined by runaway inflation, factories were smokeless, silent, and dismantled. The transportation system had broken down completely. Agriculture, which was the economic lifeblood of the South, was almost hopelessly crippled. The cotton fields now yielded a lush harvest of nothing. The slave labor system had collapsed. Seed was scarce, and the livestock had been driven off by plundering Yankees. Beaten but unbent, many high-spirited white Southerners remained dangerously defiant. They cursed the damn Yankees and spoke of your government in Washington. Conscious of no crime, these former Confederates continued to believe that their view of secession was correct and that the lost cause was still a just war. And this is going to provide problems moving forward. Confusion abounded in the South about the precise meaning of freedom for the African Americans, the newly freed slaves. Emancipation took effect haltingly and unevenly in different parts of the Confederacy. Union armies marched in and out of various localities. Many African Americans found themselves emancipated and then re-enslaved. The variety of responses to emancipation, by whites as well as African Americans, illustrated the sometimes startling complexity of the master and slave relationship. Loyalty to masters prompted some slaves to resist the liberating Union armies, while other slaves' pent-up bitterness burst forth violently on the day of liberation. Many newly emancipated slaves joined Union troops in pillaging their masters' possessions. Prodded by Yankee armies of occupation, all masters were eventually forced to recognize their slaves' permanent freedom, though some African Americans initially responded to news of their emancipation with suspicion and uncertainty. Many freed slaves took new names. Though many whites perceived such behavior as insubordinate, they were forced to recognize the realities of emancipation. Tens of thousands of emancipated African Americans took to the roads, some to test their freedom, others to search for long-lost spouses, parents, and children. Emancipation thus strengthened the African American family. Many newly freed men and women formalized slave marriages for personal and pragmatic reasons, including the desire to make their children legal heirs to the plots of land they now owned. Other African Americans left former masters to work in towns and cities where existing African American communities provided protection and mutual assistance. The westward flood of these exodusters was stemmed only when the steamboat captains refused to transport more African American migrants across the Mississippi River. The church became the focus of the black community life in the years following emancipation. As slaves, African Americans had worshipped alongside whites, but now they formed their own churches, pastored by their own ministers. The Baptist, the Methodist Episcopal churches were a few of the examples of these churches. These churches formed the bedrock of African American community life, gave rise to other benevolent, fraternal, and mutual aid societies, and protected newly won freedoms. Emancipation also meant education for many African Americans. Learning to read and write had been a privilege generally denied to them. Freedmen wasted no time establishing societies for self-improvement, which undertook to raise funds to purchase land, build schoolhouses, and hire teachers. They accepted the aid of northern white women sent by the American Missionary Association, who volunteered their services as teachers, and the federal government continued to help. Abolitionists had long preached that slavery was a degrading institution. Now the emancipators were faced with the brutal reality that the freedmen were overwhelmingly unskilled, unlettered, without property or money, and with scant knowledge. To cope with the problem throughout the conquered South, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau on March 3, 1865, which was intended to be a primitive welfare agency of today. It was to provide food, clothing, medical care, and education both to freedmen and to white refugees. Heading the Bureau was a warmly sympathetic friend of the African Americans, Union General Oliver O. Howard, founded and president of Howard University. The Bureau helped with education the most. It taught 200,000 African Americans how to read. Many former slaves had a passion for learning, partly because they wanted to close the gap between themselves and the whites, and partly because they longed to read the Word of God. But in other areas, the Bureau's accomplishments were meager or even mischievous. Although the Bureau was authorized to settle former slaves on 40-acre tracts confiscated from the Confederates, little land actually made it into their hands. Instead, local administrators often collaborated with planters in expelling African Americans from towns and cajoling them into signing labor contracts to work for their former masters. Still, the white South resented the Bureau as a meddlesome federal interloper that threatened to upset white racial dominance. The Freedmen's Bureau will eventually expire in 1872. Few presidents have faced more of a perplexing sea of troubles than confronted Andrew Johnson. No citizen has ever reached the White House from humbler beginnings. He was born to impoverished parents in North Carolina, orphaned very early in life. He never attended school, but was apprenticed at age 10 to a tailor in North Carolina. Johnson became active in politics in Tennessee, where he had moved and shone as an impassioned champion of the poor whites against the planter aristocrats. Elected to Congress, he attracted much favorable attention in the North, but not in the South, when he refused to secede with his state and was appointed war governor of Tennessee. Political leniency next thrust Johnson into the vice presidency. Lincoln's Union Party in 1864 needed to attract the support from the war Democrats and other pro-Southern elements, and Johnson, who actually was a Democrat, seemed to be the ideal man. Johnson was a man of many parts. He was intelligent, able, forceful, and gifted with honesty. He was also devoted to duty and to the people. He was a champion of states' rights and the Constitution, and he often presented a copy of the document to visitors. Yet he was somewhat of a misfit, a Southerner who did not understand the North, a Tennessean who had earned the distrust of the South, a Democrat who had never been accepted by the Republicans, a president who had never been elected to the office. He was not at all at home in the presidency. He could be hot-headed, contentious, and stubborn. He was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time to handle Reconstruction, and the policy he devised may have failed in his hands. We'll talk more about Andrew Johnson and the impact of his plan for Reconstruction in our future lessons in class.